The 10 organizations covered in this video collectively generate revenues that analysts estimate exceed $2 trillion annually across global criminal markets. They have survived wars, dictators, military operations, and court trials that took years and cost hundreds of lives to build. They operate in every country on Earth, controlling the cocaine your city buys, the fentanyl that is killing tens of thousands of people per year, the migrants crossing deserts and seas, and, in some cases, the politicians making the laws meant to stop them. 3 of these organizations, the Ndrangheta, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Albanian Mafia, are directly connected to each other right now, running the largest cocaine supply chain in human history. The word mafia was invented in Sicily in the 1800s. Today, it describes a problem that belongs to every country on Earth, including yours. Case 1. Italy, Calabria. The 'Ndrangheta Calabria is the very bottom of Italy, the toe of the boot-shaped peninsula wedged between 2 seas, economically one of the poorest regions in Western Europe. For most of recorded history, the Italian government in Rome treated it as an afterthought. There were no major industries, no political power, and not much of anything that the rest of the country paid attention to. That neglect, it turned out, was exactly the environment in which the most powerful criminal organization in the world was allowed to grow. The 'Ndrangheta, pronounced Ndrangheta, was not born through some grand criminal ambition. It grew slowly and quietly in the olive groves and small towns of Calabria throughout the second half of the 19th century. Police reports and court sentences from as far back as the 1880s show organized criminal groups already operating in the province of Reggio Calabria, running extortion rackets and settling disputes with violence. By 1890, a court in the same province described a group that was hierarchically organized and already enforcing a strict code of silence among its members. For decades, nobody outside Calabria paid serious attention. The Sicilian Mafia was louder, more violent, more political, and far more interesting to journalists and prosecutors. The Neapolitan Camorra had centuries of visible history. The 'Ndrangheta was, for most of the 20th century, treated as a local problem in a poor and forgotten region. That turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. By the time the world fully understood what had been building in Calabria, the 'Ndrangheta had already spread to more than 40 countries and planted itself at the center of the global cocaine trade. As of the 2020s, it is described by law enforcement agencies, Interpol, and academic experts as the richest and most powerful organized crime group on the planet. The name 'Ndrangheta comes from the Greek word Ndrangheta, meaning bravery or manly virtue. That is how the organization has always preferred to see itself, not as a crime syndicate, but as a society of honorable men governed by loyalty and a strict code of respect. The FBI traces its formal origins to the 1860s, when a group of Sicilian outlaws established a base in the Aspromonte Mountains of Calabria after being expelled from Sicily. Whatever the precise starting point, the historical record is settled. By the 1880s, the 'Ndrangheta existed as a functioning criminal organization with its own structure, initiation rituals, and internal rules. What set the 'Ndrangheta apart from almost every other criminal group in the world was its structure. The basic unit of the organization is called an ndrina, a single family clan. There are roughly 150 of these clans operating in Calabria, each controlling its own territory, making its own decisions, and running its own criminal operations. In most cases, membership is not chosen, it is inherited. Anti-mafia prosecutor Salvatore Boemi told the Italian government's Anti-Mafia Commission that membership is often acquired simply by being born into the right family. The organization established a coordinating body called La Provincia in 1991 to mediate disputes between clans, but each ndrina still operates with significant independence. This structure, which looks like a weakness on paper, turned out to be one of the greatest advantages any criminal organization has ever possessed. To dismantle a traditional hierarchical group like the Sicilian Mafia, you target the boss. You turn someone close to him, and you work your way down the chain. With the Ndrangheta, there is no single boss to remove. You can arrest 30 members of one family, and the other families keep operating without interruption. Italian investigators estimated in 2007 that the Ndrangheta had between 6,000 and 10,000 members worldwide at its core. But the extended network of associates and collaborators pushes that number far higher. Until the 1960s, the Ndrangheta mostly stayed within Calabria, earning money through extortion, robbery, and later, cigarette smuggling. The construction of the Salerno to Reggio Calabria highway between 1962 and 1974, a project worth hundreds of billions of Italian lira, gave the organization its first major opportunity to move into public works corruption. Ndrangheta-linked firms won construction contracts, and businesses that refused to cooperate faced bombings, theft, and worse. Then came the kidnappings, the crime that would ultimately finance the Ndrangheta's transformation into a global power. Between the early 1970s and the mid-1990s, more than 200 kidnappings in Italy are attributed to the Ndrangheta. The ransom money from those crimes became the seed capital for something far bigger than extortion and construction fraud. On July 10, 1973, at 3 in the morning, 16-year-old John Paul Getty III was snatched by Ndrangheta members in the Piazza Farnese in Rome. He was the grandson of J. Paul Getty, who was at that time the richest man in the world. The kidnappers blindfolded him, drove him to Calabria, and locked him in a cave in the mountains. They demanded $17 million. His grandfather refused to pay, publicly stating that he had 14 other grandchildren and that paying for one would make all of them targets. Months passed. In November 1973, 4 months after John Paul disappeared, an Italian newspaper received a package containing a lock of hair and a severed human ear. The note inside said, "This is Paul's ear. If we do not receive money within 10 days, the other ear will arrive." In other words, he will arrive in little bits. Even that was not enough to make J. Paul Getty move quickly. He negotiated the demand down from $17 million to just under $3 million, paid only $2.2 million of that himself, the maximum amount that was tax-deductible under U.S. law at the time, and lent the remainder to his own son at 4% interest. John Paul Getty III was found alive on December 15, 1973, shivering at a petrol station on the Salerno to Reggio Calabria highway. He was 17 years old by then. 9 kidnappers were eventually arrested, including 2 senior Ndrangheta members named Girolamo Piromalli and Saverio Mammoliti. Only 2 people were convicted. The senior members walked free due to lack of evidence. Most of the ransom money was never recovered. John Paul Getty III never recovered from the ordeal. He developed severe addiction to alcohol and drugs in the years that followed. In 1981, at 25 years old, he suffered a stroke after taking a combination of Valium, methadone, and alcohol. The stroke left him quadriplegic, partially blind, and unable to speak for the rest of his life. He died on February 5, 2011, at age 54. The Ndrangheta used the ransom money from that kidnapping, and dozens more like it, to fund their entry into the cocaine trade in the 1980s. That decision changed everything. The rising demand for cocaine across Europe and America, combined with the fact that Italian law enforcement was almost entirely focused on the Sicilian Mafia and the Camorra, gave the Ndrangheta a clear path to dominate the market. They built direct relationships with Colombian drug cartels and established supply routes that are still in use today. According to a 2008 report by the Italian Anti-Mafia Parliamentary Commission, the Ndrangheta eventually came to control approximately 80% of all cocaine trafficked into Europe. Roughly 80% of Europe's cocaine enters through the port of Gioia Tauro in Calabria, and the Ndrangheta controls those flows. In financial terms, the scale of what this produced is almost difficult to comprehend. A study by the Italian research institute Demoscopica in 2014 estimated the Ndrangheta's annual revenue at roughly $60 billion, more than the combined revenues of McDonald's and Deutsche Bank in that year, and larger than the entire GDP of countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Uruguay. A 2010 diplomatic cable from the United States Embassy in Rome, which became public during the 2010 WikiLeaks releases, estimated that Ndrangheta activities accounted for approximately 3% of Italy's entire GDP. The organization launders its money through investments in construction companies, restaurants, supermarkets, hotels, car dealerships, and real estate across Europe, North America, and Australia. It does not simply traffic drugs and hide the cash. It reinvests profits into legitimate-looking businesses so thoroughly that it has become, in some parts of Calabria, functionally the largest economic actor in the region. By 2020, the Ndrangheta was operating in more than 40 countries. Interpol, which launched a dedicated international cooperation program specifically targeting the Ndrangheta in 2020, describes it as operating in more than 84 countries. Despite this scale, the Ndrangheta remained remarkably difficult for law enforcement to penetrate. Between 1994 and 2007, out of a total of 794 organized crime members who cooperated with Italian authorities across all major criminal groups, only 100 came from the Ndrangheta. That is around 12%, strikingly low for an organization of its size. The reason goes back to the blood structure. Betraying the Ndrangheta means betraying your own family, literally. The people you would be giving evidence against are your cousins, your brothers, your uncles. Wives have left cooperating witnesses. Children have been cut off. The social cost of turning against the organization is enormous, and for decades, it was effective. The moment that Ndrangheta became impossible to ignore internationally came on the night of August 15, 2007. 6 Italian men, all originally from the province of Reggio Calabria, were shot dead outside an Italian restaurant called Da Bruno in Duisburg, Germany. They had spent the evening celebrating the 18th birthday of one of the group. 2 gunmen fired more than 70 shots. 5 men were dead before emergency services arrived. The 6th died on the way to the hospital. The victims were aged between 16 and 39. The killings were the most dramatic moment in a long-running feud between 2 Ndrangheta clans from the Calabrian village of San Luca, the Ndrangheta family and the Pelle Votari Romeo family. The feud had started in 1991 after 2 young men from one clan were killed during a fight at a carnival. It ran through decades of murders and truces and murdered wives before finally spilling into the heart of Germany on an August night. Giovanni Strangio, who was identified as one of the 2 gunmen in Duisburg, managed to escape. He was eventually arrested in March 2009 in an apartment in Diemen, a suburb of Amsterdam, where he was living with his wife and young son. He was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison in Italy. The Duisburg massacre forced German authorities, and much of the rest of Europe, to finally acknowledge that the Ndrangheta was not a Calabrian problem. It was a European problem. A 2009 confidential report by Germany's Federal Criminal Police estimated that around 900 people connected to the Ndrangheta were active in Germany, owning hundreds of restaurants and operating as major players in the property market in the former East Germany. The most represented single Ndrangheta family in Germany at that time came from the town of San Luca, with approximately 200 members identified. On December 19, 2019, Italian law enforcement launched what became the largest coordinated anti-mafia operation in more than 3 decades. Approximately 2,500 police officers and military agents raided Ndrangheta hideouts, homes, and businesses simultaneously across Italy and in Germany, Bulgaria, and Switzerland. More than 400 people were arrested in a single night. The operation, called Rinascita Scott, was named after Scott W. Sieben, a United States Drug Enforcement Administration agent who had spent 8 years in Italy working to expose the financial ties between the Ndrangheta and Colombian cocaine cartels. Sieben died in a car accident after returning to the United States. The trial that followed began in January 2021 in a specially built bunker courtroom in the southern Italian city of Lamezia Terme. The bunker cost 4.7 million euros to construct from a former industrial warehouse and could seat nearly 1,000 people. It was built purely to hold a single criminal trial. More than 400 lawyers represented the defendants. Roughly 900 witnesses provided testimony over the course of almost 3 years. Among the defendants were not only Ndrangheta bosses and foot soldiers, but also a former senator from the Forza Italia party named Giancarlo Pitelli, a former mayor, a former regional council member, and a former local police chief. The trial exposed the degree to which the organization had embedded itself into the legitimate institutions of Calabrian public life: town halls, hospitals, law firms, and political offices. On November 20th, 2023, the 3 judges delivered their verdict. It took 1 hour and 40 minutes to read the rulings aloud. 207 people were convicted. The total prison time handed down came to more than 200 years. 5 defendants received life sentences. Clan bosses Saverio Razionale and Domenico Bonavota each received 30-year sentences, the maximum under Italian law. Former Senator Pitelli received 11 years for Mafia collusion and passing confidential information to the organization. The former local police chief received 2 years and 6 months. Around 100 of the 338 defendants were acquitted, and the verdicts are subject to 2 further rounds of appeal under Italian law. Lead prosecutor Nicola Gratteri, who had spent years building the case and who lives under permanent police protection because of threats against his life, told Reuters after the verdict, "Today's ruling means a whole province of Calabria has been liberated from the top brass of the criminal group." The 'Ndrangheta itself, however, was not liberated from anything. The Rinascita Scott trial focused on just one province, Vibo Valentia, and on primarily one clan, the Mancuso family. The other 149-plus families across Calabria, and the thousands of 'Ndrangheta members operating across Europe, North America, Australia, and South America, continued their operations. In July 2025, Interpol announced the arrest of Giuseppe Palermo, the 'Ndrangheta's top boss in Latin America, in Bogotá, Colombia. Palermo had been coordinating cocaine purchases from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and overseeing the maritime routes that brought those drugs into Europe. The Rinascita Scott trial is not the end of the 'Ndrangheta. It is not even close. It was the first major legal strike against an organization that has operated for over 140 years, survived 2 world wars, outlasted Mussolini's crackdowns in the 1930s, and turned a poor and forgotten corner of southern Italy into the headquarters of the world's most profitable criminal empire. The 'Ndrangheta earns an estimated $60 billion per year from cocaine trafficking alone, plus billions more from money laundering, arms trafficking, extortion, illegal waste disposal, and real estate investment across 5 continents. It controls roughly 80% of the cocaine entering Europe. It operates in more than 84 countries. It recruits its members at birth. And it does most of this in silence. No flashy wars with the government, no public declarations, no movies made about its bosses while they are still alive. Just business, generation after generation, family by family, from a mountainous stretch of coastline at the very bottom of Italy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next country on this list has a mafia that is younger, louder, and responsible for the deadliest drug crisis in American history. A group that the United States government formally designated a terrorist organization in 2025, and whose two top leaders were both arrested in the same year for the first time in the cartel's entire existence. Case 2. Mexico, the Sinaloa Cartel. Sinaloa is a state on Mexico's Pacific coast, and for most of the 20th century, it was known for one thing above almost everything else: growing things. Marijuana plants and opium poppies thrived in the mountain ranges of the Sierra Madre, and the farmers who cultivated them had been supplying drug traffickers across the border since the 1960s. One of those farmers turned traffickers was a man named Pedro Aviles Perez, who in the late 1960s took what had been small-scale smuggling operations and built them into something more organized. He was also the first trafficker in Mexico to use aircraft to move drugs, a method that would become standard across every cartel that followed him. In September 1978, Aviles Perez was killed in a shootout with Mexican federal police in Sinaloa. Among the young men he had trained was a former police officer turned trafficking broker named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, who would take everything Aviles had built and multiply it many times over. Félix Gallardo, along with Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, founded the Guadalajara Cartel between 1978 and 1980. Through the mid-1980s, this organization dominated Mexico's drug corridors along the U.S. border, running multi-ton cocaine shipments for the Colombian cartels in exchange for a 50% cut of the product. The whole structure collapsed in February 1985, when cartel members captured, tortured, and murdered Enrique Camorra, an undercover DEA agent who had spent years mapping their operations. The killing brought enormous pressure from the U.S. government on Mexico, and by 1989, Felix Gallardo was arrested. Before going to prison, he divided his trafficking network into regional factions, called plazas, and handed them to trusted lieutenants. The western Pacific coast, which included Sinaloa State and the city of Culiacán, went to Joaquín Guzmán Loera and Ismael Zambada Garcia. What they built from that handoff became the Sinaloa Cartel. Joaquín Guzmán Loera was born in 1957 in a small mountain village in Sinaloa called La Tuna. His family was poor, and he entered the drug trade as a teenager working for Pedro Aviles. He learned the trade from the ground up: logistics, smuggling routes, bribery, and the use of violence. By the early 1990s, as head of the newly independent Sinaloa Cartel, he was expanding operations faster than any cartel in Mexico had managed before. He pioneered the use of underground tunnels, sophisticated, engineered tunnels equipped with lighting, ventilation, and rail systems, to move drugs beneath the U.S.-Mexico border in quantities that overwhelmed law enforcement detection. The DEA would later say he imported more narcotics into the United States than any other trafficker in history. In June 1993, Guzman was arrested in Guatemala after a violent incident at Guadalajara's International Airport, in which a Mexican cardinal was accidentally killed during what was intended as an ambush on Guzman by a rival cartel. He was extradited to Mexico and sentenced to 20 years in prison for murder and drug trafficking. Mexican prison, it turned out, was not much of an obstacle. Guzman had the guards on his payroll from the beginning. He ordered meals from a menu, received visitors, continued running the cartel by mobile phone, and reportedly had women brought to him regularly. When Mexico's Supreme Court issued a ruling in January 2001 that made extradition to the United States easier, Guzman knew his comfortable arrangement was about to end. He paid an estimated $2.5 million in bribes, and on January 19, 2001, a prison guard opened his electronically secured cell door, and a maintenance worker wheeled him out of the maximum security Puente Grande prison in a laundry cart. He was driven to a petrol station and disappeared. He stayed free for 13 years. During that time, the Sinaloa cartel grew into the largest drug trafficking organization in the world. Forbes magazine listed Guzman as one of the most powerful people on the planet between 2009 and 2013. The cartel expanded from marijuana and cocaine into heroin and methamphetamine, establishing distribution networks in nearly every major American city and dozens of countries worldwide. The U.S. Attorney General stated that between 1990 and 2008 alone, the Sinaloa cartel was responsible for importing nearly 200 short tons, that is, approximately 180,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States. Guzman was finally caught again on February 22, 2014, when Mexican Navy forces tracked him to a beach resort in Mazatlan, Sinaloa. He was arrested without a shot being fired. Mexico held him in the Altiplano Federal Prison, considered the country's most secure facility. On the night of July 11, 2015, prison cameras recorded Guzman walking into the shower area of his cell, the one spot not covered by surveillance. He never walked back out. His associates had spent months digging a tunnel from a construction site nearby directly into the floor of his shower. The tunnel was 1.5 kilometers long, roughly 1 mile, buried 10 feet underground, fitted with lighting, a ventilation system, and a motorcycle mounted on a rail track. He rode it to freedom. It was the most elaborate prison escape in Mexican history, and it was an enormous embarrassment to the government of President Enrique Peña Nieto. A nationwide lockdown was declared within hours. Guzman spent 16 months on the run, during which he made contact with Mexican actress Kate del Castillo and American actor Sean Penn, apparently wanting a movie made about his life. Text messages arranging a secret meeting between the three were intercepted by intelligence agencies. In January 2016, Mexican Marines tracked him to a house in the coastal city of Los Mochis. 5 people were killed in the resulting gunfight. Guzman escaped through another tunnel before being captured a few hours later, hiding in a drainage canal beneath the city. He was extradited to the United States in January 2017 and went on trial in a New York federal courtroom in November 2018. The trial lasted 3 months. Witnesses described in detail the cartel's violence, its corruption of Mexican government officials and military officers, and the sheer volume of drugs it had moved across decades. He was convicted on February 12, 2019, on all counts, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, and was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He was ordered to forfeit $12.6 billion. He now sits in ADX Florence in Colorado, the United States' highest security federal prison, in a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell, 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. While El Chapo's story dominated headlines for years, the man who actually kept the Sinaloa cartel running longer than anyone, and who proved even more difficult to catch, was Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo. Born on January 1, 1948 in Sinaloa, El Mayo had been at the center of Mexican drug trafficking since the 1970s. Unlike El Chapo, who lived large and became a celebrity criminal, El Mayo was methodical, patient, and invisible. He avoided cameras, kept a low profile, rarely moved without trusted security, and managed to avoid arrest for his entire adult life, approximately 5 decades as one of Mexico's most wanted traffickers. The U.S. State Department raised the reward for information leading to his arrest to $15 million in 2021. At the time of his arrest in 2024, he had pending indictments in at least 5 separate U.S. federal jurisdictions. What brought El Mayo down was not law enforcement. It was betrayal from within his own organization. After El Chapo's imprisonment in 2019, his 4 sons, known collectively as the Chapitos, took over their father's faction of the cartel. Tensions between the Chapitos and El Mayo's faction had been building for years. On July 25, 2024, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, then aged 38, lured El Mayo onto a private aircraft under the pretense of inspecting potential investment properties in Mexico. The plane did not go to Mexico. It flew to the Santa Teresa International Jetport near El Paso, Texas. When the plane landed, U.S. authorities were waiting. Both El Mayo, then 76 years old, and Guzman Lopez were taken into custody. The aircraft had not filed a flight plan with U.S. authorities. El Mayo's attorney immediately issued a statement saying his client had been kidnapped, that he was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and forced onto the plane with a hood over his head. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico confirmed at a press conference that the operation involved a betrayal within the cartel, and that no U.S. agents participated in luring Zambada out of Mexico. On August 25, 2025, El Mayo pleaded guilty in a Brooklyn federal court to 1 count of racketeering conspiracy and 1 count of running a continuing criminal enterprise. He had spent his entire adult life in drug trafficking without ever spending a single day in prison. That streak ended the moment the plane touched down in Texas. The internal war that followed the July 2024 arrests split the Sinaloa cartel down the middle. The Chapitos faction and the Mayos faction, El Mayo's loyalists, began fighting each other for control. Starting in September 2024, that internal conflict escalated into open warfare across Sinaloa, with shootings, kidnappings, and mass violence in the state's cities and towns. This was no longer a cartel fighting rivals or the government. It was a cartel destroying itself from within, and civilians in Culiacan and surrounding areas paid the price. The scale of what the Sinaloa cartel is responsible for, beyond the power struggles and prison escapes, is impossible to reduce to a single number. The cartel operates in at least 40 countries. Its members, associates, and facilitators number in the tens of thousands, according to the DEA. In the 12-month period ending October 2024, 84,076 Americans died from drug overdoses, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the DEA identifies the Sinaloa cartel as one of the 2 organizations most responsible for that death toll, primarily through fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, roughly 80 times more potent than morphine. 2 milligrams, less than a few grains of salt, is considered a potentially lethal dose. The Sinaloa cartel sources the chemical precursors from China, manufactures the drug in clandestine labs in Mexico, and ships it across the U.S. border hidden in vehicles, packages, and cargo shipments. On December 3, 2024, a single raid on cartel-linked sites in Sinaloa produced a seizure of 1,500 kilograms, over 1.65 tons of fentanyl, the largest single fentanyl seizure ever recorded anywhere in the world. In February 2025, the Trump administration designated the Sinaloa cartel a foreign terrorist organization, the same legal category applied to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That designation allows U.S. prosecutors to charge anyone providing material support to the cartel under counterterrorism statutes, with a maximum penalty of life in prison. In May 2025, the DEA announced its largest single seizure of fentanyl pills in its history. 3 million pills connected to a Sinaloa-linked network operating across New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Utah. The cartel that started with a group of poor farming families growing marijuana in the Sinaloa Mountains in the 1960s is now the primary driver of the deadliest drug crisis in American history. Fentanyl is currently the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 34. The DEA, the Justice Department, and the State Department all describe the Sinaloa cartel as one of the most significant threats to U.S. national security. Both of its founding leaders are now in U.S. federal custody. The organization is killing itself in a civil war, and yet its operations continue. The drugs keep moving, the deaths keep mounting, and the machine keeps running. Underscore underscore quote underscore one underscore underscore. While the Sinaloa cartel operates through a combination of bribery, market dominance, and industrial-scale manufacturing, the next organization on this list built its power on an entirely different foundation, one that goes back to Soviet-era Russia and a criminal network so deeply woven into the Russian state that a leaked U.S. diplomatic cable said it operates with the protection of Russia's own intelligence services. Case 3. Russia, the Solntsevskaya Bratva. Sergei Mikhailov was born in 1958 in the Solntseva neighborhood of Moscow, a working-class suburb in the southwest of the city, close to the MKAD Ring Road, the M3 highway leading toward Ukraine, and the Vnukovo International Airport. He trained as a waiter and worked at the Solntsevskaya Hotel in Moscow, a place frequented by criminals, businessmen, and black market operators during the Soviet era. In 1984, he was arrested for insurance fraud. He had sold his motorcycle and then reported it stolen. He was sentenced to 6 months in a Soviet prison camp. When he got out, he went into business with 2 brothers he had met through the Moscow underworld, ex-boxers named Viktor and Alexander Averin. What the 3 of them built from that starting point became the most powerful Russian criminal organization in history, and, according to a 1995 FBI report, the most powerful Eurasian crime group in the world in terms of wealth, influence, and financial control. The Solntsevskaya Bratva, the Solntsevo Brotherhood, takes its name from the neighborhood where it was founded. In Russian criminal culture, Bratva simply means brotherhood. The word carries weight. The organization that Mikhailov and the Averin brothers created in the late 1980s operated from the beginning on a different philosophy than the traditional Russian criminal societies that had come before it. The established code of the Soviet criminal underworld, called Vori v zakone, thieves in law, was rooted in a strict rejection of any contact with the state or legitimate business. Mikhailov rejected that code entirely. He preferred to think of himself as a businessman. He wanted the organization to look like a business, act like a business, and make money like a business, just through methods that no legitimate business would use. That philosophy became the blueprint for everything that followed. The early years of the organization centered on krysha, the Russian word for roof, used as slang for protection. Businesses paid the Solntsevskaya a fee, usually 10 to 20% of their revenue, and in exchange, the organization guaranteed they would not be robbed, threatened, or harassed. Any business that refused faced arson, beatings, or worse. The Solntsevo neighborhood's location near Vnukovo International Airport gave the group an early logistical advantage. They muscled into the car import business that was just beginning to open up as Soviet restrictions eased in the late 1980s, controlling the flow of imported vehicles through the transport networks surrounding the airport. In 1989, Mikhailov was arrested for extortion. He spent roughly 18 months in a Russian detention facility awaiting trial. On the day the trial was scheduled to begin, the main witness against him refused to testify. Mikhailov walked free. This outcome, witnesses going silent, evidence disappearing, cases collapsing, would become a recurring pattern throughout the organization's history. The men who threatened those witnesses were never charged. The prosecutor's cases simply evaporated. Then came December 25, 1991, and everything changed. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. What followed was one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history. Prices increased by 300% in January 1992 alone. By the end of that year, the inflation rate had reached 2,509%. The Russian GDP contracted by an estimated 40% between 1991 and 1998. Ordinary people's savings were wiped out almost overnight. Factories stopped paying workers. Hospitals ran out of medicine. The state, which had for 70 years controlled every aspect of economic life, suddenly had no mechanism left to enforce contracts, protect businesses, or maintain basic order. Into that vacuum, criminal organizations moved with extraordinary speed. The Solntsevskaya Bratva was perfectly positioned. Private businesses opening for the first time in Russia's history had nowhere to turn for protection when rivals threatened them or customers refused to pay. The courts were overwhelmed, understaffed, and corrupt. Police officers were underpaid and often complicit. The Solntsevskaya offered what the state could not: enforcement, security, and resolution. Businesses that hired them got protection. Businesses that refused faced the consequences. The organization expanded across southwest Moscow, then across all of Moscow, then into other Russian cities and regions. By the mid-1990s, it was estimated the Solntsevskaya Group controlled approximately 120 legitimate firms and businesses in the Moscow, Crimea, and Samara regions. They owned banks, casinos, and had acquired a stake in Vnukovo International Airport itself. The expansion came with violence. In the early 1990s, the Solntsevskaya's dominance in Moscow was challenged by Chechen criminal organizations who were competing for the same markets. The Solntsevskaya formed an alliance with another Moscow gang, the Orekhovskaya, and other Slavic criminal groups to drive the Chechens out. The conflict involved targeted killings, ambushes, and at least one documented mass gunfight at the Kazakhstan cinema in Moscow, in which 6 Chechens and 4 Russians were killed. The Solntsevskaya ultimately held their territory. In 1992, Mikhailov sent one of his top associates, a notorious criminal boss named Vyacheslav Ivankov, known by his nickname Yaponchik, meaning Little Japanese due to his facial features, to the United States to consolidate control over Russian organized crime operations among the large Russian émigré communities in New York. Ivankov arrived in March 1992 on a business visa, settled in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, a neighborhood known as Little Odessa for its large Soviet émigré population, and began running extortion operations against Russian-American businessmen. In January 1993, Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs notified the FBI that Ivankov was in the country and was managing Russian organized crime activities. The FBI spent 2 years building a case against him. On June 8, 1995, FBI agents raided an apartment in Brighton Beach and arrested Ivankov. They found him with thousands of dollars in cash, multiple passports under different names and nationalities, and a .38 caliber revolver wrapped in a sock that witnesses said was thrown from the apartment window during the arrest. He was charged with extorting $3.5 million from an investment firm called Summit International, which was run by 2 Russian businessmen. He was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to 9 years and 7 months in a U.S. federal prison. The day after Ivankov's arrest in 1995, a senior FBI official in Washington told the Associated Press that getting Ivankov was the equivalent of arresting a Gambino, referring to Carlo Gambino, one of the most powerful American mafia bosses of the 20th century. The comparison made clear how seriously U.S. law enforcement was taking the Solntsevskaya's reach into American territory. Meanwhile, Mikhailov himself had moved to Western Europe. He relocated to Israel using a false passport, then moved to Switzerland in 1995, where he purchased an 800,000 Swiss franc villa in the village of Borex in the Vaud canton. He enrolled his children in private school, drove a Rolls-Royce, and spent approximately $15,000 a month on clothing, according to court documents. He was wanted for questioning by the police of the United States, Belgium, and Israel on suspected charges ranging from money laundering to running international prostitution networks. On October 15, 1996, Swiss authorities arrested Mikhailov at Cointrin Airport in Geneva on charges of belonging to an organized crime group, using false documents, and violating Swiss laws restricting foreigners from buying property. What followed was a case that became one of the most striking examples of how the Solntsevskaya dealt with legal threats in Western countries. While Mikhailov sat in Swiss custody awaiting trial, witnesses against him began dying. Vadim Rosenbaum, the same businessman from Moscow who had originally been extorted by Mikhailov in the late 1980s, who had fled Russia and agreed to testify against him in Switzerland, was shot dead at his home in the Netherlands before the trial began. A father and son were found murdered in Holland. Another man was shot dead in Amsterdam. A Belgian journalist who had written articles about Mikhailov was warned by local police that a contract had been placed on his life. Belgian police arrested a corrupt Belgian police officer who was about to carry out the hit. During the trial, which began on November 30, 1998, 80 witnesses came to court wearing bulletproof vests. An officer of Russia's FSB, the Federal Security Service, successor to the KGB, appeared to give a character statement describing Mikhailov as a respectable businessman. The Russian government refused to provide key evidence to Swiss prosecutors. The case collapsed. Mikhailov was acquitted and walked out of the courtroom. He subsequently sued the Swiss government for income lost during his 2 years of pre-trial detention and was awarded approximately $450,000 in compensation. This was not an accident or a fluke. A leaked U.S. diplomatic cable published during the 2010 WikiLeaks releases stated that the Solntsevskaya Bratva continues its racketeering operations under the protection of Russia's FSB. A former U.S. State Department source cited in a 2012 cable published by the British newspaper The Guardian stated that both Russia's Interior Ministry and the FSB have close links to the Solntsevskaya, with the FSB providing the organization's primary cover. Mikhailov has consistently denied any connection to organized crime and insists he is an honest businessman. He has never been convicted of any organized crime charge. According to Fortune magazine estimates published in 2014, the Solntsevskaya Bratva generates approximately $8.5 billion annually. Its 1995 FBI assessment described it as the largest criminal group in Russia, with around 5,000 members and deep involvement in drug trafficking, prostitution, arms smuggling, and racketeering. The organization has direct links to Colombian drug cartels through an arrangement brokered by the Sicilian Cuntrera Caruana crime family, giving the Solntsevskaya a pipeline into the international cocaine trade. A 2021 joint operation between Europol and Spanish police uncovered a Solntsevskaya-linked logistics chain that was bringing multiple metric tons of cocaine annually into Europe, laundering the proceeds through real estate companies, luxury car dealerships, and cryptocurrency wallets in Marbella, Spain. The Solntsevskaya's structure is deliberately designed to survive pressure from law enforcement. Rather than a rigid top-down hierarchy, it operates through semi-independent brigades, called brigady, that each conduct their own operations but pay tribute upward to the organization's leadership. If a brigade is dismantled, the others continue. The organization has no single point of failure. It also sits in a unique legal gray zone. Many of its operations are conducted through legitimate-looking businesses, and its leadership lives openly as apparent business people. Mikhailov, who is now in his late 60s, has his own website. He has posted photographs online of what he claims is a luxury watch presented to him by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov denied that any such gift was given. On December 20, 2025, Viktor Averin, Mikhailov's co-founder of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, died when a boat capsized in icy water at the Admiral Marina in the Mytishi district near Moscow. He was reportedly maneuvering the vessel when it overturned. Averin had been a central figure in the organization since its founding 4 decades earlier. The Solntsevskaya Bratva continues to operate internationally with active cells across Europe, Israel, the United States, and Latin America. From Russia's gray zone criminal empire, which operates with state protection and hides behind legitimate business fronts, the next country on this list produces a mafia that is older, more visible, and built not on post-Soviet chaos, but on centuries of entrenched local tradition. A criminal organization so embedded in its home city that one of its bosses was photographed using a hospital as a meeting place for crime summits, while a porter on the payroll controlled which patients received medical appointments. Case 4. Japan. The Yakuza. Japan has had organized criminal groups embedded in its society for longer than many nations have existed as countries. The roots of what the world now calls the Yakuza stretch back to the Edo period, which ran from 1603 to 1868. During that era, 2 distinct groups operating on the margins of Japanese society gradually developed the hierarchies, codes, and rituals that still exist in modified form today. The Bakuto were gamblers. They ran illegal gambling dens in abandoned temples and shrines at the edges of towns, made money from loan sharking operations inside those dens, and maintained their own security personnel. The Takiya were itinerant street vendors, nomadic peddlers who sold goods at markets and festivals, formed protective networks among themselves, and paid rent to bosses in exchange for assigned stalls and protection. Both groups were considered among the lowest social classes in feudal Japan. Both developed strict hierarchies based on loyalty between a boss called an oyabun and subordinates called kobun. And both developed the rituals that came to define Yakuza culture, including the practice of yubitsume, the ritualized cutting of the tip of the little finger as an act of apology or penance. The word Yakuza itself comes from the Japanese card game Oicho Kabu. In that game, the worst possible hand consists of cards totaling 8, 9, and 3. Yakuza in Japanese. The name was essentially a self-deprecating label that these groups embraced, a way of saying they were the outcasts, the ones society considered worthless. Over centuries, these outcasts built criminal organizations powerful enough to eventually employ hundreds of thousands of people and generate billions of dollars per year. Of all the organizations that emerged from this tradition, none grew larger or more powerful than the Yamaguchi Gumi. In 1915, a former fisherman from Awaji Island named Harukichi Yamaguchi, born in 1881, gathered approximately 50 dock workers in the port city of Kobe and created what would become Japan's dominant crime syndicate. Yamaguchi had worked as a foreman for a labor dispatch operation at Kobe's port, controlling the allocation of day laborers for cargo loading and unloading. He broke away from his employer and took his men with him, forming the original Yamaguchi Gumi as a labor and entertainment management operation. He cultivated relationships with city council members, secured contracts for theatrical performance management in the Naniwabushi style of dramatic recitation, and ran the organization as a combination of legitimate labor contracting and criminal muscle until his death on January 17, 1938, at age 57. His son, Noburu, took over and expanded into the music industry and sumo wrestling before dying in 1942 from injuries sustained in a fight. It was the third boss, Kazuo Taoka, who took over in June 1946, who transformed the Yamaguchi Gumi from a regional labor organization into the most powerful criminal force in Japan. When Taoka became boss, the group had just 33 members. He set up a talent agency and signed exclusive management contracts with 2 of the biggest entertainment stars in Japan, singer Misora Hibari and the wrestling superstar Riki Dozan. He became vice chairman of the Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance. The Korean War, which began in 1950, sent enormous quantities of U.S. military materials through Kobe's port, supercharging the stevedoring operations Taoka controlled. Other Yakuza groups that refused to cooperate with the Yamaguchi-gumi faced violent reprisals. Groups that agreed to cooperate were absorbed. By 1975, the organization's membership had grown from 33 to 11,000. By 1963, at the peak of Yakuza power across all groups nationally, total Yakuza membership in Japan reached 184,100 people, according to the Japanese National Police Agency. Of those, the Yamaguchi-gumi controlled a dominant share. The Yakuza occupied a uniquely visible position in Japanese society for most of the 20th century. Unlike Italian or Russian organized crime, which operated in the shadows, Yakuza offices had plaques on the front door. Members wore their gang insignia openly. They were known to their neighbors, their local police, and their local politicians. They served functions that Japanese society tolerated or quietly relied on: settling business disputes, providing muscle for construction projects, running entertainment districts, and controlling local gambling operations. In the 1960s and 1970s, far-right political organizations hired Yakuza members to break up left-wing demonstrations. Japan's relationship with its organized crime was, for decades, a form of unofficial coexistence. The Yamaguchi-gumi brought in billions of dollars annually from extortion, gambling, prostitution, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, real estate kickbacks, construction fraud, stock market manipulation, and internet pornography, according to the U.S. Treasury Department. The group's headquarters in Kobe is a compound owned through real estate companies controlled by Yakuza executive members. In February 2012, the U.S. Treasury Department froze American-owned assets linked to the Yamaguchi-gumi and imposed sanctions on its godfather, Kenichi Shinoda, whose real name is Shinobu Tsukasa, and its deputy godfather, Kiyoshi Takayama. President Obama formally identified the Yamaguchi-gumi as a significant transnational criminal organization under Executive Order 13,581, placing it in the same legal category as the Brothers Circle from Russia, the Camorra from Italy, and Los Zetas from Mexico. The Treasury described the organization as involved in drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, prostitution, fraud, and money laundering, and said it maintained criminal affiliates in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The relationship between the Yakuza and the Japanese legal system is unlike anything in the world. Japan had no law formally designating Yakuza organizations as criminal until the Anti-Boryokudan Act was enacted in May 1991 and came into force in March 1992. Before that, being a member of a Yakuza group was not a crime. The 1992 law changed the landscape dramatically, designating specific organizations as violent criminal groups and placing restrictions on their activities. Starting in 2010, every one of Japan's 47 prefectures progressively enacted Yakuza exclusion ordinances, which made it illegal for ordinary citizens and businesses to knowingly provide services, loans, or commercial relationships to Yakuza members. The effect was devastating for the organizations. Banks would not give them accounts, insurance companies would not sell them policies, landlords would not rent to them. Businesses that dealt with them could be publicly exposed. Between 1990 and 2020, total Yakuza membership fell by 70%. By the end of 2024, Japan's National Police Agency reported 9,900 full members and 8,900 associate members across all Yakuza groups, a total of 18,800, the 20th consecutive year of decline, and the first time the number had fallen below 20,000. The average age of a Yakuza member at the end of 2022 was 54. Only 5% of members were in their 20s. Over half were 50 years old or older. Young people no longer join. The money is harder to make than it used to be. The legal risks are higher, and Japanese society's tolerance for visible organized crime has evaporated. In 2022, the Anigasaki Kai gang in Tokyo, believed to have started in the early Taisho era around 1912 to 1926, notified other Yakuza groups that it was disbanding entirely. Its main business in recent years had been ticket scalping, buying tickets for concerts and sports events and reselling them at inflated prices. Even that was no longer profitable enough. The Yamaguchi-gumi's decline mirrors the broader collapse. At its peak, the group had over 55,000 members. By the end of 2024, it had 3,300 active members. In August 2015, a major internal rebellion occurred when powerful factions, including the Kobe-based Yamaken-gumi, the Osaka-based Takumi-gumi, and the Kyoyu-kai, broke away to form the rival Kobe-Yamaguchi-gumi. The split was driven by financial grievances. Members were paying 850,000 yen per month in membership fees to headquarters, while struggling to earn enough to meet basic expenses. The breakaway group set fees at under 300,000 yen, but that triggered further fragmentation when their own members found even that unsustainable. By April 2025, the Yamaguchi-gumi formally notified Hyogo Prefectural Police that it intended to end its decade-long internal war with the splinter factions, pledging in writing to stop all fighting. The move was widely interpreted as an attempt to get the organization's designation removed as a conflict-related crime group, a status that allows police to arrest 5 or more members simply for gathering together. The most extreme example of what Japanese Yakuza are still capable of came from a smaller group called the Kudo-kai, based in Kitakyushu in Fukuoka Prefecture. The Kudo-kai is formally designated under Japanese law as a particularly dangerous designated Yakuza group, a classification that exists for only the most violent organizations. In August 2021, the Fukuoka District Court sentenced Satoru Nomura, the 74-year-old leader of the Kudo-kai, to death. He became the first designated Yakuza boss in Japanese history to receive the death penalty. Nomura was convicted of directing 4 attacks on civilians between 1998 and 2014, including the fatal shooting of a former fisheries cooperative chairman, the shooting of a Fukuoka police officer in 2012, the stabbing of a nurse in 2013, and a 2014 attack on a relative of one of the other victims. After the judge read the death sentence, Nomura looked at him and said, "You will regret this for the rest of your life." The conviction was achieved despite the absence of direct evidence linking Nomura to the specific orders. The court accepted the prosecution's argument that the attacks could not have been carried out without authorization from the Kudo-kai's tightly controlled hierarchy. On March 12, 2024, the Fukuoka High Court overturned the death sentence and replaced it with life imprisonment, acquitting Nomura of the specific 1998 murder charge on the grounds that the logic of the original ruling could not be confirmed by rules of evidence and experience. He is now 78 years old and serving a life sentence. His second-in-command, Fumio Tanoe, had his life sentence upheld. The Yakuza as an institution is shrinking. The offices are closing, the members are aging, the money is drying up, and the young men who once would have joined are finding other paths. But what remains, even at 18,800 total members, is still a network of organized criminal power operating in a country of 124 million people, still generating billions of dollars, still capable of violence when it chooses, and still embedded in the fabric of Japanese business and politics in ways that a century of tradition does not dissolve in a decade. While Japan's Yakuza are technically legal to join and openly visible, the next organization on this list operates with almost no visibility at all. A group built entirely around family blood ties, operating across 40 countries, controlling 80% of the cocaine entering Europe, and making so much money annually that their earnings exceed the GDP of entire countries. Case 5. Italy, Naples. The Camorra. Naples is Italy's third largest city, built around one of the most beautiful bays in the world, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. For most of its history, it was one of the most densely populated cities in Europe, packed into narrow streets and steep neighborhoods where poverty, corruption, and the absence of effective government created conditions that criminal organizations have exploited for centuries. The Camorra, pronounced Camorra, was born in those conditions and has survived every attempt to destroy it for more than 200 years. It is, by most historical accounts, the oldest continuously active criminal organization in Italy and arguably in the world. The word Camorra first appeared in official records in 1735, when a royal decree from the Bourbon rulers of the Kingdom of Naples authorized the establishment of 8 gambling houses in the city. The groups that ran and protected those gambling operations were already organized enough to demand formal recognition. Most historians trace the Camorra's emergence as a structured criminal society to the early 19th century, particularly to the Neapolitan prison system, where criminal gangs developed strict internal hierarchies, codes of conduct, and initiation rituals. The original initiation ceremony involved a dagger, a loaded pistol, a glass of supposedly poisoned wine, and a lancet used to open a vein. The initiate dipped his hand in his own blood and swore loyalty to the organization on pain of death. In or around 1830, prisoners completing their sentences carried the organization's structure out of the prisons and into the streets of Naples. Within a generation, the Camorra had embedded itself into every layer of Neapolitan life. Its members were hired by merchants to supervise the loading and unloading of goods at the port, because the police were considered too corrupt and ineffective to protect commerce. The corrupt Bourbon regime did not attempt to suppress the Camorra. It absorbed it. Camorra members were taken into the police service, appointed as local officials, and used to manage crowds and maintain order during political events. The 1901 Cerreto Inquiry, a formal government investigation into corruption and governance in Naples, found that the city was effectively run by what it called the High Camorra, a network of middle-class criminals who had penetrated the municipal administration, the courts, and the supply of public works contracts, and who fed off the lower Camorra operating in the streets below them. The report described the state bureaucracy as a field that the High Camorra harvested and exploited. The Camorra's defining structural feature, the one that makes it fundamentally different from the Sicilian Mafia or the Ndrangheta, is that it has no central authority. There is no godfather, no single boss, no commission that oversees the entire organization. The Camorra is made up of approximately 180 independent clans, each controlled by its own capo. The clans negotiate alliances, fight wars, and make business deals entirely on their own initiative. When a top boss is arrested, his clan does not collapse. It simply reorganizes under someone else. As one Camorra boss told a court during testimony, "Campagna can get worse because you could cut into a Camorra group, but another 10 could emerge from it." That is not a boast. It is an accurate description of how the organization functions. After Italian unification in 1861, the new government tried to suppress the Camorra. The effort produced limited results. In 1912, a major criminal trial resulted in convictions for numerous senior Camorra figures, dealing a serious blow to the organization's old hierarchical structure. Many Camorristi fled to the United States, where they eventually merged into Italian-American crime families. By the 1920s, under Mussolini's fascist government, aggressive police crackdowns further weakened what remained. For a period, it genuinely appeared that the original Camorra had been broken. Then came World War II. Allied bombing campaigns destroyed large sections of Naples in 1943 and left the city's population starving in the rubble. When Allied forces entered Naples in October 1943, they made deals with Camorra bosses to provide intelligence and protection for American shipyards in the port. What followed was an economic catastrophe that the Camorra exploited completely. At the beginning of 1944, Almost a third of all Allied military supplies in the port of Naples were being stolen and sold on the black market. The city's formal economy had ceased to function. Everything, food, medicine, cigarettes, clothing, moved through criminal channels. The Camorra did not start that black market, but it controlled it, profited from it, and used those profits to rebuild itself. By the 1970s, Camorra gangs were making the equivalent in today's terms of approximately $215 million per year and employing between 40,000 and 60,000 people in the Campania region. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, Naples became the central hub for international tobacco smuggling into Europe.
Then, in the late 1970s, the organization moved into cocaine and heroin trafficking, a decision that transformed its financial power. In the 1980s, Sicilian Mafia bosses serving prison sentences under Italy's forced relocation law were sent to live in Naples, where they established direct contact with Camorra clan leaders and helped accelerate the drug trade. By the early 2000s, the Camorra controlled significant portions of the cocaine market in Spain, which is the primary entry point for South American cocaine into Europe. In October 2004, a catastrophic internal conflict erupted in the northern Naples neighborhoods of Scampia and Secondigliano. The Di Lauro clan, which had built a tightly managed drug empire in those neighborhoods, made the decision to centralize its operations, removing the autonomy that neighborhood drug dealers had previously enjoyed. One dealer, Raffaele Amato, refused to accept the new terms. He fled to Spain, organized a rebellion, and assembled a coalition of breakaway groups known as the Sicionisti, the secessionists. On October 28, 2004, the Di Lauro clan ordered the murders of two rebel associates named Fulvio Montanino and Claudio Salierno. 3 days later, at the funeral of those two men, police arrested two gunmen who were waiting with machine guns to shoot into the funeral procession. The Scampia feud had begun. Over the next 2 years, the feud resulted in more than 100 murders in one of the most densely populated residential areas in Italy. Gunmen arrived on motorbikes and opened fire on targets in daylight, in busy streets, in front of witnesses who said nothing because saying something meant death. In one documented incident, an innocent man named Attilio Romano was shot dead when assassins mistook him for a rival's nephew. In December 2004, a police operation involving 1,500 officers arrested 52 suspected gang members. In January 2005, Cosimo Di Lauro, the young boss who had made the fatal decision to centralize the drug trade, was arrested. Raffaele Amato was arrested in Spain in February 2005. On September 16, 2005, police arrested Paolo Di Lauro himself, the patriarch of the clan, in a small apartment in Secondigliano. He was sentenced to 30 years for drug trafficking. The feud's violence continued sporadically until 2008. At the end of October 2006, a separate wave of killings between 20 competing Camorra clans cost 12 lives in just 10 days. The Interior Minister sent more than 1,000 additional police to Naples. The following year, there were over 120 murders in the city. As of 2023, according to Naples public prosecutor Giovanni Melillo speaking before the Italian government's Anti-Mafia Commission, the most powerful groups in the Camorra today are the Mazzarella clan and the Secondigliano alliance, an alliance of the Licciardi, Contini, and Malardo clans. Between 2011 and 2016, this federation was estimated to control criminal assets worth approximately 130 million euros. When police raided its operations, they seized 80 cars, 81 motorcycles, restaurants, bars, supermarkets, shops, car parks, garages, diamonds, and luxury watches. According to a 2023 study, Italian organized crime groups generated an estimated profit of 40 billion euros that year, equivalent to approximately 2% of Italy's GDP. But the Camorra's most uniquely devastating crime has nothing to do with drugs or extortion. In the years between 1990 and 2005, the organization trafficked an estimated 14 million tons of toxic industrial waste, heavy metals, battery acids, industrial solvents, asbestos, and radioactive material from factories in northern Italy and dumped it across the fields and hills of Campania in unauthorized landfills, alongside roads, and in sites that would later contaminate the groundwater supply of millions of people. A Camorra boss turned informant named Carmine Scavoni described the scheme in devastating detail before an Italian government committee in 1997. He said that the operations extended to radioactive waste from other European countries and described industrial firms paying a fraction of legal disposal costs to have their waste disappear. His testimony was so explosive, implicating politicians, officials, and businesses across Italy, that the Italian parliament classified it and withheld it from public view for 16 years. It was not released until 2013, under mounting public pressure over the health crisis that had developed in what became known as the Terra dei Fuochi, the Land of Fires. The Terra dei Fuochi covers approximately 90 municipalities across Naples and Caserta provinces, home to roughly 2.9 million people. Studies published from the 2000s onward documented elevated rates of cancer in the region. A 2014 Italian National Institute of Health report found excessive rates of tumors in newborn infants in the area, particularly brain tumors. Italy's Higher Institute of Health found an 11% higher incidence of tumors and related deaths for men in the Naples province. In January 2025, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Italy had violated the right to life of those 2.9 million citizens. The court confirmed that increased cancer rates and groundwater contamination had been recorded across the 90 municipalities and gave Italy 2 years to implement a comprehensive strategy to address the contamination and its health effects. That ruling came because a criminal organization decided that burying industrial poison in people's drinking water was a profitable business model. The Camorra has killed thousands of people with guns and knives over 200 years. It has also been slowly killing millions more through contaminated soil and groundwater for the past 4 decades, a crime that courts are still trying to hold it accountable for today. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Camorra built its power through street-level violence and control of a single region, the next organization on this list built its empire through a completely different model. Family blood ties spread across 40 countries, making the Albanian Mafia one of the fastest-rising and most feared criminal networks in Europe, now responsible for the movement of more cocaine into the continent than any other group. Case 6. Albania, the Albanian Mafia. Albania is a small country on the western edge of the Balkans, about the size of the state of Maryland, with a population of roughly 2.8 million people. For 45 years, from 1946 to 1991, it was one of the most isolated nations on Earth under the Stalinist communist dictatorship of Enver Hoxha. No private property, no freedom of movement, no contact with the outside world. When that regime collapsed in 1991, Albania had almost nothing. No functioning banking system, no real economy, no effective police force, and no independent courts. That vacuum, and what happened next, is the direct origin of one of the most powerful and fastest-rising criminal organizations in the world today. When the borders opened in early 1991, hundreds of thousands of Albanians tried to leave immediately. On March 6, 1991, several thousand Albanians seized cargo ships and fishing boats in the ports of Vlora and Durrës and crossed the Adriatic Sea to Italy. Approximately 20,000 people arrived in the southern Italian city of Brindisi that spring. Then, on August 7, 1991, A freight ship called the Vlora had just docked in the port of Durrës, returning from Cuba with a load of sugar. Before the crew could unload the cargo or begin repairs on the broken-down engines, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people stormed the vessel, jumping into the water, climbing ropes, filling every inch of the deck. The captain, Halim Milaki, could not get them off the ship. He sailed it to Italy on damaged engines with no radar and no food. The Vlora arrived in Bari on August 8th. Italian authorities bussed the passengers to an old stadium, kept them there in terrible conditions, and deported most of them within days. Among those crossing the Adriatic in those first chaotic years, alongside people simply looking for a better life, were emerging criminal networks made up of former military officers, former members of the communist secret police, known as the Sigurimi, and local clan leaders who had watched everything they knew collapse overnight. These men had weapons training, tactical knowledge, and a culture built on absolute loyalty to family and clan. Italy, with its short sea crossing and its existing organized crime infrastructure, was the first testing ground. The worst was still to come inside Albania itself. Through the mid-1990s, Albania's first experiment with market economics went badly wrong. Financial companies offering impossibly high returns, some promising 100% interest, began attracting investors across the country. At their peak, the pyramid schemes drew in an estimated 2/3 of Albania's entire population. Their combined liabilities reached approximately $1.2 billion, equivalent to nearly half of Albania's GDP at the time. Between January 8th and January 16th, 1997, around 25 of these firms collapsed simultaneously, wiping out the life savings of hundreds of thousands of families. The country erupted. Riots broke out nationwide. The government fell. In the chaos, military arsenals and police weapons depots across Albania were looted. More than 100,000 small arms, mostly Kalashnikov automatic rifles, poured onto the streets and eventually across the border into Kosovo, where the Kosovo Liberation Army was beginning its armed campaign against Yugoslav forces. Approximately 2,000 people died in the 1997 unrest. In 1997 alone, 73% of all violent deaths recorded in Albania were classified as revenge killings, according to research on the period. The Kanun, a 15th-century Albanian code of honor covering hospitality, property, and blood vengeance, had been suppressed under communism. With the state effectively gone, it came back. Families locked their sons inside homes for years to protect them from revenge obligations. As many as 1,376 families were reportedly involved in active blood feuds, affecting an estimated 210,000 individuals. That was the environment in which Albanian organized crime structured itself. Not in one city, not under one boss, but across dozens of fluid family clans, known in Albanian as fis or khaks, tied together by blood, regional origin, and the concept of besa. Besa is an Albanian term meaning a sworn word of honor, a sacred promise made on a person's life. In criminal networks, breaking besa carries consequences not just for the individual, but for their entire family back in Albania. Investigators and academics who have studied the Albanian Mafia describe besa as the invisible enforcement mechanism that makes betrayal almost non-existent. There is no court system, no written contract. There is besa. That is enough. Unlike the Italian mafias, Albanian criminal networks have no single dominant structure, no national boss, no commission. They are made up of small cells of typically 3 to 12 members, linked by kinship and reputation, capable of forming alliances and dissolving them based on the job at hand. When a member is arrested, his phone, which contains the entire business network, is immediately recovered by associates
and can be sold to another criminal group for up to £100,000. The network does not die. It is sold and reconstituted elsewhere. By the mid-1990s, Albanian gangs had established themselves as key transporters of heroin along the Balkan route, the corridor running from Afghanistan through Turkey, across the Balkans, and into Western Europe. But heroin was a stepping stone. The real transformation came when Albanian networks established direct relationships with cocaine suppliers in Latin America, largely through their years working alongside the Ndrangheta in Italy. The typical profile of an arrested Albanian trafficker, according to investigators cited by Balkan Insight in a January 2026 report, is a man in his 40s with 5 to 15 years of residence in Italy and strong ties to Italian organized crime. It was the Ndrangheta that introduced Albanian traffickers to the infrastructure and contacts needed to operate in Latin America. Then, the Albanians built on those connections and, in some cases, surpassed their teachers entirely. The Cella Chopia network is the clearest example of how far that transformation went. Ervis Cella, born in Pecin, central Albania, operated as the network's cocaine broker in Latin America, based in Paraguay. Frank Chopia, born in Elbasan, handled finances and logistics in Europe. Their operation ran the entire chain from start to finish, purchasing and processing cocaine in Paraguay, concealing it inside legitimate cargo, shipping it to European ports, distributing it wholesale across multiple countries, and laundering the proceeds through real estate, a 5-star tourist resort, villas, and bank couriers carrying cash from the UK back to Albania. On November 4, 2020, containers from a ship traveling from Paraguay to Israel cleared the port of Antwerp in Belgium. Hidden among shipments of coconut soap and plaster adhesive were 12 tons of cocaine. According to internal communications recovered from the Sky ECC encrypted messaging network, which law enforcement had secretly broken into, those 12 tons were sold within 3 weeks. 7.8 tons of it sold in just 3 days. Chopia boasted to an associate that it was the largest single cocaine shipment ever to enter Europe, surpassing the previous record of 8.7 tons. On the same day the Antwerp shipment was secured, Chopia instructed Cella to dispatch a further 20 to 30 tons. In February 2021, German authorities seized 16.4 tons of cocaine from the network at the port of Hamburg, hidden inside 1,700 tins of wall putty, with a street value estimated at up to 3.5 billion euros. At the time, the largest cocaine seizure in European history. Investigators from Albania's Anti-Corruption and Organized Crime Unit, SPAC, supported by Europol, estimated that the network trafficked approximately 36.4 tons of cocaine into Europe in just 6 months across 2020 and 2021, with a further 22 tons stockpiled in Paraguay awaiting shipment. Chopia was eventually arrested in Dubai in September 2023. Cella was arrested in Albania in 2024. The prosecutors who brought the case described the organization as capable of directly influencing the price of cocaine across European markets. The Cella Chopia clan was not an outlier. Former SPAC chief Altin Dumani stated that in a single year, Albanian prosecutors dismantled 9 distinct groups accused of moving more than 16 tons of cocaine from Latin America to Europe. Europol's 2024 report, Decoding the EU's Most Threatening Criminal Networks, the most comprehensive assessment of organized crime in the bloc ever produced, drawing on data from 27 EU member states and 17 other countries, identified Albanians as among the 5 most threatening criminal nationalities in Europe, flagged specifically for cocaine and cannabis trafficking. The report found Albanian networks operating in more than 40 countries, with primary operations concentrated in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. In the United Kingdom, the story has been equally dramatic. The National Crime Agency has stated on record that Albanian criminal groups exert considerable control over Britain's cocaine market. The UK Home Office has estimated that market at approximately £6 billion annually. By the end of 2024, Albanian nationals made up 10.6% of the entire foreign prison population in England and Wales, more than any other single nationality. In 2010, that figure was 1.5%. Albanian gangs entered the UK market around the year 2000 with a deliberate strategy: higher purity cocaine at lower prices, undercut existing suppliers, and use violence to hold territory. An Albanian drug boss who spoke anonymously to British media described the strategy plainly. In 2009 and 2010, his organization cut the price of a kilogram of cocaine from 35,000 to £30. Established dealers lost customers. The Albanians absorbed them. The NCA has estimated that hundreds of millions of pounds are smuggled out of the UK by Albanian criminal groups every year, primarily back to Albania, where the money flows into construction, real estate, the banking system, and what one Tirana journalist described as a city beginning to look like a miniature Dubai. In January 2025, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Italy had violated the right to life of 2.9 million citizens living in toxic waste-poisoned land controlled by the Camorra. But in Naples, the Camorra still operates in partnership with Albanian networks. The two organizations work together on cocaine distribution routes that the Albanians source and the Italians distribute through Campania. The Albanian Mafia does not own the territory. It owns the supply chain. The Chinese Triads built a criminal empire through an entirely different model, one rooted not in the chaos of a collapsed state, but in centuries of secret society tradition and a global diaspora stretching across every continent on Earth. Their story begins in the ruins of a dynasty, not the ruins of communism, and their reach today extends from the Golden Triangle to the marijuana farms of California. Case 7. China and Hong Kong. The Chinese Triads. The word triad comes from the triangular symbol used by a network of Chinese secret societies that emerged during the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, which ruled China from 1644 to 1912. The Qing were led by the Manchus, an ethnic group from northeast China, viewed by the Han majority as foreign conquerors. The rallying cry of the resistance movements that formed in the shadows was Fan Qing Fu Ming, oppose the Qing, restore the Ming. Secret societies organized around that idea multiplied across southern China over the following 2 centuries. The most significant was the Tian Di Hui, known in English as the Heaven and Earth Society, which Qing dynasty archives trace back to approximately 1761 in Jiangzhou Prefecture in Fujian Province. Researchers at Stanford and in Beijing and Taipei have established through those archives that the society was founded not as a formal political movement, but as a mutual aid brotherhood, people helping each other survive in a society where the state provided nothing. The anti-Manchu ideology came later, providing what was essentially a legitimate-sounding cover for what had already become a criminal network. The Tian Di Hui spread across Fujian and Guangdong, across Taiwan, and into the Chinese diaspora communities that had settled across Southeast Asia. Its initiation ceremony involved blood oaths, sworn on a sword, with recruits cutting their own fingers and mixing blood with wine to seal loyalty to the brotherhood. These rituals were meticulous, symbolic, and deliberately designed to make betrayal feel like a spiritual transgression rather than just a practical risk. As the 19th century progressed and the Qing dynasty weakened under pressure from the Opium Wars and internal rebellions, the Triads grew. Branches multiplied and took different names. By the end of the 1800s, British colonial officials in Hong Kong estimated that at least 1/3 of the Chinese population there had some connection to the societies. Sun Yat-sen, who led the 1911 revolution that finally overthrew the Qing dynasty, was a senior figure within the Hongmen, the broader network from which the Triads descended. After the Qing fell, the secret societies that had framed their purpose as overthrowing an imperial dynasty found themselves without the political mission that had given them legitimacy. What remained was the organizational structure, the criminal businesses, and the culture of sworn loyalty. Those did not disappear. They adapted. The most dramatic demonstration of what the Triads had become came on April 12, 1927, in Shanghai. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, locked in a power struggle with the communist faction inside his own coalition, needed muscle he could control outside the military chain of command. He turned to the Green Gang, the dominant Triad-linked criminal organization in Shanghai, controlled by a boss named Du Yuesheng. Before dawn on April 12th, Green Gang members dressed in workers' overalls with white armbands poured out of the foreign-controlled concessions and began attacking communist union offices across the city. Soldiers moved in behind them to disarm the workers' militias. Hundreds were shot and beheaded in the streets. Estimates of the total number killed in Shanghai and in the crackdown that followed across nationalist-controlled territory run from the hundreds to the low thousands on that day alone. Chiang subsequently granted Du Yuesheng the rank of general in the National Revolutionary Army. The relationship between Chinese political power and criminal organizations had been formalized in blood on the streets of a major city. When the Communists won the Civil War and the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the Triads fled south and east, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, and to Burma. By the 1950s, an estimated 300,000 Triad members were living in Hong Kong under British colonial rule. The British government had banned the organizations in Hong Kong in 1845, and yet there they were, stronger than ever. The number of distinct Triad groups eventually consolidated to approximately 50, of which 14 were placed under active police surveillance. There were 4 main clusters: the Chu Chao group, which included the Sun Yi-on, the 14K, the Wo group, which included Wo Xing Wo, and a 4th grouping of smaller societies. The 14K was founded in 1945 by Kuomintang Lieutenant General Kot Siu Wong in Guangzhou as an anti-communist action group. In 1949, it relocated to Hong Kong with the rest of the defeated nationalist forces. Those same forces who had retreated into Burma from Yunnan province brought with them the connections and territory to begin controlling the opium growing in the region that would become known as the Golden Triangle, the mountainous borderlands of Burma, Laos, and Thailand. The 14K became the primary distributor of that opium to Hong Kong, then refined into heroin by chemists operating in the colony's clandestine laboratories. From Hong Kong, those shipments went to North America and Europe. The Golden Triangle at its peak was producing approximately 80 tons of heroin per year, and the distribution of that heroin, from field to street, was under the effective control of Triad leaders operating out of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. The 14K today has an estimated 20,000 members split across 30 subgroups. It is the second largest triad in the world. The Sun Yi-on is considered the largest. In the 1980s and 1990s, the Sun Yi-on completely controlled the Hong Kong film industry, extorting movie studios, demanding fees from productions, and coercing actors into participation. The same period saw the Triads embed themselves into Hong Kong's entertainment and nightclub economy, into real estate, and into the construction supply chain. During the 1990s, the Sun Yi-on established large-scale entertainment businesses in the Chinese city of Shenzhen, directly across the border from Hong Kong, buying nightclubs and karaoke bars and building relationships with local government officials that allowed them to operate with minimal interference. In 1998, when the Beijing-backed government in Hong Kong was facing a significant pro-democracy protest movement, Triad-connected groups were deployed to intimidate demonstrators. Researchers at the University of Bologna documented that during the Occupy Central movement in 2014, up to 200 gangsters from Wo Xing Wo and Sun Yi On were mobilized to disrupt the protests. Some disguised as pro-democracy activists to provoke confrontations with police, others directly attacking demonstrators in the street. The same researchers concluded, based on interviews with Triad members, that these operations were paid for by business interests connected to the Hong Kong government.
That pattern, criminal organizations acting as enforcers for political and economic power, stretches unbroken from Chiang Kai-shek's Shanghai in 1927 to the streets of Hong Kong nearly a century later. The relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Triads is officially one of opposition. The CCP has conducted crackdowns on Triad activity in mainland China on multiple occasions. But the reality documented by US and European intelligence officials, by the Brookings Institution, and by the 2024 ProPublica investigative series is considerably more complicated. US and foreign national security officials have stated that the Chinese state maintains a tacit alliance with Chinese organized crime in the US and globally. Triads provide useful services, moving illicit funds offshore for Chinese elites, acting as influence agents in diaspora communities, suppressing political dissidents abroad, and providing plausible deniability for operations the state wants done, but cannot officially order. The most visible current example of this is the takeover of illegal marijuana markets across the United States. When Oklahoma voters legalized medical cannabis in 2018, Triad-linked criminal networks recognized the opportunity immediately. Chinese-funded farms began appearing across the state by the hundreds. By the time investigators began piecing together the full picture, the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics estimated that approximately 2,000 of the 7,000 cannabis farms in the state had a Chinese criminal connection, whether in financing, labor supply, or both. The operation extended far beyond Oklahoma. ProPublica's 2024 investigation documented Triad-connected illegal cannabis operations from California to Maine. Chinese immigrants, many smuggled across the Mexican border, some trafficked specifically to work in these operations, were found locked in farms, unpaid, exposed to toxic chemicals, and unable to leave. In the first 8 months of the 2024 fiscal year, U.S. Border Patrol apprehended approximately 31,000 Chinese nationals illegally crossing the southwest border, more than 15 times the total for all of 2019. A senior DEA official told ProPublica that drug trafficking, money laundering, and human smuggling all run through the same networks. The DEA has documented meetings in the Flushing neighborhood of New York where high-level Triad figures, including some traveling from mainland China, gathered to divide territory and manage disputes within the U.S. cannabis operation. According to ProPublica's reporting, the 14K Triad is the primary overseer at the highest level of this network, providing the organizational backbone that keeps competing groups from going to war. The Triads also carry out conventional drug trafficking on a scale that makes them among the most significant narcotics organizations in the world. They smuggle chemical precursors from Chinese factories to North America for the production of fentanyl and methamphetamine. They traffic ketamine through the United States. They have become, according to Wikipedia's documented law enforcement assessments, the principal money launderers for major drug cartels in Mexico, Italy, and elsewhere. A service function that makes them indispensable partners to criminal organizations far beyond the Chinese diaspora. On April 14, 2025, in Rome's Pineto district, a man named Zhang Daiyong, aged 53, known in the underworld as Ah Sheng, and his partner Gong Xiaoqing, aged 38, were cycling home when assailants on a motorcycle pulled alongside them and fired at least 6 shots. Both were killed with bullets to the backs of their heads and chests.
Italian carabinieri confirmed the killings were linked to what investigators call the coat hanger wars, a violent turf battle among Chinese triad-linked criminal factions competing for control of the fast fashion logistics industry across Europe, centered in Prato near Florence, but extending across Italy, France, Germany, and Spain. Zhang Daiyong was the Rome representative of Nai Zhong, described by Italian anti-mafia prosecutors as the most powerful Chinese organized crime boss in Europe.
Currently on trial in Florence in a case called China Truck, stemming from a 2018 investigation into human trafficking and textile smuggling. Zhang Naizhong is accused of accumulating a near monopoly on goods distribution across a large part of Europe through threats and violence against Chinese business owners. No suspects have been arrested for the double murder. Guns in Italy are heavily restricted. A public execution-style double murder is extraordinarily rare. The fact that it happened, in plain view, on a residential street, against someone about to testify in a major trial, is a statement about how far the Chinese criminal presence in Europe has grown. The Nigerian Black Axe started life as a student fraternity on a university campus in 1977. Within 4 decades, it became a global criminal organization with approximately 30,000 members, pioneering the advance fee fraud that has drained billions from victims on every continent, and now operates under the watchful eyes of Interpol across 21 countries. Case 8. Nigeria. The Black Axe. Benin City sits in the south of Nigeria, in Edo State, on the edge of the Niger Delta. It was the seat of one of West Africa's greatest kingdoms for nearly 1,000 years, until British troops marched in, massacred hundreds of people, looted treasuries filled with bronze sculptures and ivory carvings that now sit in European museums, and dismantled everything. That history, of a proud civilization ransacked by colonial force, runs directly through the founding story of the organization that would become one of the most dangerous transnational criminal networks on Earth. On July 7, 1977, 9 undergraduate students at the University of Benin sat down and formed a new brotherhood. They called it the Neo-Black Movement of Africa, or NBM. The founding 9 were not criminals. They were young, educated men who were angry at colonialism, at the ongoing poverty and inequality left behind by colonial rule, at a world they believed had deliberately held Black people down. Inspired in part by the Black Panther movement in the United States, they built an organization around Pan-African ideology and what they called intellectual radicalism. Their symbol was an axe smashing the chains of a slave. Their colors were black for blackness, white for peace, and yellow for intellect and strength. They produced a magazine. They wrote a code of conduct. Within a decade, the movement had chapters on most major university campuses across Nigeria. Then, the oil price collapsed. In the early 1980s, the revenue that had been holding Nigeria's military government together dried up. Public funding for education disappeared. Graduate unemployment soared. Successive military regimes, threatened by student protest movements demanding democracy, began doing something that would prove catastrophic in the long term. They started arming campus fraternities to suppress political organizing. Groups that had formed around ideology were handed weapons and given tacit permission to use them. The violence that resulted was not incidental. It was state-sponsored. As Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, himself the founder of Nigeria's first university fraternity, said in an interview with Harper's Magazine, "Campus cults turned into authentic breeding grounds of Nigerian organized crime." By the late 1980s, the original founders of the NBM had lost effective control of what they had built. In 1994, the graduating class of the University of Benin formally separated the criminal wing from the university-based organization. That criminal wing kept the axe symbol. It kept the structure. It kept the brotherhood oath.
It became what is now universally known as the Black Axe, or in the language of Nigerian criminal culture, simply the Axemen. Membership is reserved for men. The initiation process, described by multiple former members and documented in law enforcement files and academic research, involves taking a binding oath of absolute loyalty. Breaking that oath is considered punishable by death. Members are sometimes subjected to severe physical ordeals and swear allegiance not just to the group, but to a spiritual framework rooted in traditional Nigerian religious practice that makes leaving feel like a life-threatening act, not just a practical risk. Members are identified by their uniform: black trousers, a long-sleeved white shirt, and a black beret bearing the axe insignia. They are known to each other as Axemen. Internally, the organization is divided into roles, including what are called butchers, members responsible for enforcement, punishment, and fighting rival groups. Inside Nigeria, the Black Axe is a street-level terror organization. Benin City residents have formed armed civilian vigilante groups specifically to protect neighborhoods from Axemen. According to Harper's, some parts of the city have gone essentially ungoverned in this respect. Locals told a journalist that when authorities see the cults, they say nothing happened. Nigeria recorded nearly 6,000 gang-related deaths across 31 states between 2006 and 2021, with confraternity conflicts, Black Axe versus the Supreme Aye confraternity versus the Mafites versus the Vikings versus the Buccaneers, making up a substantial portion of that toll. In July 2012 alone, reports confirmed 4 people killed in 2 days in Benin City in fighting between Black Axe and Aye. In May 2011, 18 people were killed in similar clashes. These numbers are almost certainly undercounts because most violent crime in Benin City goes unreported. Witnesses refuse to speak, lawyers cannot find testimony, and many law enforcement officers are themselves confraternity members. That last point, confraternity membership in law enforcement and politics, is central to understanding why Black Axe has survived and grown for nearly 50 years. Evidence leaked by a hacker identified as Uche Tobias demonstrated that a man named Bemigo Iyoyibo served as both national president of the Neo-Black movement and head of Black Axe from 2012 to 2016. After this became public, Iyoyibo was allowed to run for political office as a candidate for the All Progressives Congress Party in 2019. Internal communications leaked to investigators showed that in the 2012 Edo state governorship election, 35 million naira, approximately $85,000 at the time, was directed to the NBM in Benin City to protect votes for a candidate. Black Axe did not simply corrupt Nigerian politics. In many states, it became inseparable from it. The transition from campus violence to global cybercrime began in the mid-1990s, when Axemen took something that already existed, the advance fee fraud scheme, and moved it onto the internet. Advance fee fraud, known in Nigeria as 419 fraud, after Section 419 of the Nigerian Criminal Code that criminalizes it, is a scheme in which a fraudster contacts a stranger with a story about a large sum of money trapped somewhere, an inheritance, a government account, an oil contract, and asks for an upfront payment to help release it. In return, the victim is promised a share of the larger sum. The sum never materializes. The advance fees keep coming. The origins of this scheme predate the internet by decades, but the internet made it scalable. Axemen began by sending mass emails posing as Nigerian princes, lawyers, or government officials. The infamous Nigerian prince email, so well known it has become a joke in popular culture, is a Black Axe product. But the organization did not stop there. As law enforcement and the public grew wise to basic advance fee scams, Black Axe members moved into far more sophisticated and difficult to detect fraud. The most damaging form is business email compromise, or BEC. In a BEC attack, fraudsters infiltrate or convincingly impersonate the email accounts of executives, lawyers, or financial officers inside legitimate businesses. They then redirect pending wire transfers, payments a company was already planning to make, into accounts they control. The targets include multinational corporations, law firms, real estate agencies, and hospitals. The FBI arrested 13 Black Axe members in 2019, responsible for stealing more than $10 million through cybercrime. In 2021, the FBI arrested 33 more Axe operators who had stolen upward of $17 million using BEC and related schemes. According to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, Black Axe is thought to take in between $300 and $500 million per year from BEC scams in North America alone. Overall annual proceeds from cybercrime across all methods are estimated to exceed $5 billion per year. A 2022 Interpol report concluded that Black Axe and similar West African groups are responsible for the majority of the world's cyber-enabled financial fraud. The money laundering operations that support all of this are equally global. In 2017, Canadian police uncovered a Black Axe-linked money laundering scheme worth more than $5 billion Canadian dollars, processed through the Toronto suburb of Mississauga. One of the figures involved, Ikechukwu Amadi, was jailed in 2019. Another Toronto area resident, Galeb Alumari, was later sentenced in the United States for laundering tens of millions of dollars stolen through wire transfer and bank fraud schemes. Cash is moved through money mules, often Nigerian immigrants coerced or convinced to allow their bank accounts to be used for receiving and forwarding funds, through cryptocurrency, through Hawala networks, and through the purchase of cars and other goods that are then shipped to Nigeria. In Ireland, the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau identified approximately 1,000 people with links to Black Axe and estimated that 200 million euros had been stolen online in Ireland over 5 years. And that figure represented only the 20% of cybercrime that gets reported. Alongside cybercrime, Black Axe runs one of the most documented sex trafficking pipelines in the world. The pipeline begins in Benin City. Young women, predominantly from Edo State, many of them between 17 and 28 years old, many told they are going to work in shops or offices in Europe, are brought to a traditional priest before departure. There, they participate in a juju ceremony in which hair from their body, fingernails, and sometimes menstrual blood are taken. They swear an oath of loyalty and debt repayment under threat of supernatural punishment. They then travel overland by bus through Niger and into Libya, where, for many of them, the abuse begins immediately. Held in compounds, forced into sex work to cover the cost of the next stage of the journey, then loaded onto rubber boats crossing the Mediterranean. On arrival in Italy, they are handed to a madam, typically a Nigerian woman who was herself trafficked and has worked her way into a management position, and told they owe tens of thousands of euros for the journey. The International Organization for Migration estimated that 80% of the Nigerian women arriving in Italy in 2016 and 2017 were potential trafficking victims. The number of Nigerian women arriving in Italy by sea spiked from 1,454 in 2014 to 11,009 in 2016. In Palermo, Sicily, Black Axe established itself in the Ballaro neighborhood, historically a Cosa Nostra stronghold, and negotiated an arrangement with Cosa Nostra to operate on their territory in exchange for paying the Sicilian Mafia a percentage of its earnings, called a pizzo. Between April 10th and July 3rd, 2024, Interpol ran Operation Jackal 3, a coordinated law enforcement action across 21 countries on 5 continents. The operation resulted in approximately 300 arrests, the identification of over 400 additional suspects, the blocking of more than 720 bank accounts, and the seizure of $3 million in assets. In Argentina, a 5-year investigation led to the dismantling of a Black Axe-linked network. the arrest of 72 suspects, and the seizure of $1.2 million in high-quality counterfeit U.S. currency. In Switzerland, police seized cocaine and approximately 45,000 euros in cash. In Ireland, over 1 million euros in cryptocurrency was seized in a single raid. Interpol's own director of financial crime called the volume of fraud coming from West Africa alarming and increasing. The 300 arrests, significant as they are, represent a tiny fraction of an organization estimated to have 30,000 members operating across every inhabited continent.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Colombia's Clan del Golfo built its empire not with emails or university campuses, but with armed force. 9,000 fighters, a third of Colombia's municipalities, and enough power to shut down an entire country for 4 days after the extradition of its boss. Their story is next. Case 9. Colombia, the Clan del Golfo. Colombia spent most of the 20th century fighting itself. From the 1960s onward, left-wing guerrilla groups, primarily the FARC and the ELN, waged armed campaigns against the government, funded increasingly by the cocaine trade. The state responded by allowing, and in many cases directly arming, right-wing paramilitary groups whose job was to fight the guerrillas in rural areas where the army could not or would not go. Those paramilitary groups also financed themselves through cocaine. By the late 1990s, Colombia was running 3 parallel military forces simultaneously: the government, the guerrillas, and the paramilitaries. All of them swimming in drug money, all of them killing civilians. The umbrella organization for the right-wing paramilitaries was called the AUC, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. At its height, the AUC had tens of thousands of fighters and was responsible for some of the worst massacres in Colombia's modern history, killing civilians accused of sympathizing with guerrillas, torturing and displacing entire villages, operating mass graves. Under international pressure and a government deal, the AUC went through a formal demobilization process between 2003 and 2006. More than 30,000 fighters handed in their weapons. What the Colombian government did not fully account for was what would happen to the commanders, the drug routes, and the criminal infrastructure when the formal organization ceased to exist. In 2006, a senior AUC commander named Vicente Castaño, brother of the organization's founders, refused to accept the demobilization terms and ordered his lieutenants to rearm. He put 2 men in charge of rebuilding paramilitary control in the Urabá region of northwestern Antioquia, a strategically vital corridor for moving cocaine from the coca-growing heartland to the Pacific and Caribbean coastlines. Daniel Rendón Herrera, known as Don Mario, and Ever Velosa Garcia, known as HH. Don Mario had been the finance chief of one of the AUC's wealthiest blocks and knew the economics of the drug trade inside out. Together, they rebuilt from the ashes what initially went by the name Los Urabeños, later the Gaitanista Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AGC, and eventually became widely known as the Clan del Golfo. Don Mario was captured on a farm in rural Urabá in April 2009. Control of the organization then passed to 2 brothers who had been members of the AGC military corps, Juan de Dios Usuga, known as Giovanni, and Dairo Antonio Usuga, known as Otoniel. The Usuga brothers had originally been guerrillas with the EPL, a Marxist rebel group that demobilized in 1991, before joining the AUC. They brought with them the discipline and military structure of veteran fighters. Giovanni designed the AGC's expansion strategy, sending trusted lieutenants from Urabá to take control of drug trafficking corridors across the country, preferring alliances where possible and violence where necessary. In January 2012,
police located Giovanni at a ranch in the Chocó department and killed him in a raid. Otoniel took over as the sole leader. Under Otoniel, the Clan del Golfo grew into the largest criminal organization in Colombia's history. The organization runs on a franchise model. It does not try to control every detail of cocaine production, but instead positions itself at the critical transit choke points that any cocaine shipment must pass through to reach the coast. Farmers growing coca in southern Colombia pay the clan a fee. Traffickers moving cocaine through their corridors pay a fee. Anyone operating a business in territory they control, legal or illegal, pays extortion. According to a Human Rights Defenders report from 2024, the AGC is present in approximately one-third of Colombia's 1,103 municipalities.
According to the independent think tank, Indepaz, the group was operating in nearly 300 municipalities at the time of Otoniel's arrest in 2021. Membership estimates vary depending on how you count fighters versus support networks. Figures from credible sources range between 3,000 and 9,000, with the U.S. State Department citing 9,000 in its December 2025 designation. The clan controls the primary cocaine export corridors in Colombia. The Urabá region, along the Colombian-Panamanian border, is the most critical choke point. The narrow land connection between South America and Central America, through which enormous quantities of cocaine move northward. It also controls significant sections of the Pacific coast, the Caribbean coast, and routes through the Darien Gap, the dense jungle border zone where migrants and drugs move together through the same paths. The group has established direct partnerships with Mexican cartels, primarily the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, as the primary buyers of its cocaine for the U.S. market. It has maintained a relationship with the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia that controls European cocaine distribution since the days of the original AUC. According to Grokopedia's documented estimates using Colombian police data, the AGC was exporting approximately 20 tons of cocaine per month by 2021, operating through networks in 28 countries. The organization funds its military capacity through illegal gold mining as well as drugs. In remote areas of Antioquia, Chocó, and Bolívar, Clan del Golfo members operate unauthorized gold mines, using hydraulic equipment to tear up riverbeds and extract ore that is then sold through laundering chains that lead to legitimate gold markets in Dubai and elsewhere. The environmental destruction from this mining has poisoned rivers that entire indigenous communities depend on for water and food. The clan also recruits minors into its ranks and has been accused of paying fighters $3,500 for every police officer killed. Despite 6 years of a dedicated military operation called Operation Agamemnon, launched in February 2015 and involving more than 2,000 troops specifically deployed to hunt Otoniel in the Urabá jungle, he evaded capture for the entire duration of both the Santos and Duque administrations. Otoniel survived by never staying in one place for more than 3 to 5 days, never using a telephone, communicating only through physical couriers, and maintaining 8 concentric security rings around him at all times. The innermost ring consisted of approximately 20 of his best-trained fighters. The outer rings contained around 200 armed men. He slept in the jungle, in the rain, never approaching towns. On October 23, 2021, Operation Osiris culminated in the most massive Special Forces raid in Colombian military history. More than 500 soldiers, backed by 22 helicopters, descended on a jungle hillside in the Necoclí municipality of Antioquia, near the Panamanian border. The operation had been guided by satellite imagery tracked over several weeks by more than 50 signal intelligence experts working with US and UK agencies. One police officer was killed. Otoniel, 50 years old, in rubber boots,
hands bound behind his back, was flown to Bogotá on a military helicopter. Colombian President Iván Duque called it the biggest blow to drug trafficking in the country in the 21st century, and the only event comparable to the death of Pablo Escobar in 1993. On May 4, 2022, Otoniel was extradited to the United States. The next day, the Clan del Golfo declared a national armed strike, a paro armado, across the north of Colombia. It lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, armed groups enforced total shutdowns of over 100 municipalities across 11 of Colombia's 32 departments, including Antioquia, Chocó, Bolívar, Córdoba, and Sucre. Gang members burned at least 118 vehicles on highways. Roads were blocked. Shops and businesses were forced to close under threat of death. Threats painted on the walls of homes warned residents that anyone who disobeyed would face fatal consequences. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Colombia's post-conflict tribunal recorded 309 acts of violence during the strike and confirmed 24 civilians killed. A city of 500,000 people, Monteria, was largely shut down for days. The strike was the clearest possible demonstration that the arrest and extradition of the kingpin had not ended the organization. Otoniel pleaded guilty in the Eastern District of New York in January 2023 to running a continuing criminal enterprise. He was sentenced, and the U.S. attorney on the case stated that the human misery caused by his organization may never be fully calculated due to its magnitude. As of August 2025, the Clan del Golfo is led by Jobanis de Jesus Avila Villadiego, known by the alias Chiquito Malo, and reportedly has approximately 7,000 members. Its number 2, Wilmer Antonio Giraldo Quiroz, known as Siopas, was found dead in February 2023. The organization has been simultaneously conducting peace negotiations with the Colombian government of President Gustavo Petro since September 2025 and expanding its military operations against rival groups. On December 5, 2025, the Colombian government and the AGC signed an agreement in Doha, Qatar, under which the group's fighters will be allowed to gather in 3 specially designated zones starting in March 2026, with peace talks continuing and extraditions of AGC leaders to the U.S. suspended during negotiations. 11 days later, on December 16, 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio designated the Clan del Golfo as a foreign terrorist organization and a specially designated global terrorist, making it a federal crime in the United States to provide any material support to the organization and opening the legal framework for potential direct military action against it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case on this list closes on Sicily, an island that gave the world the word Mafia itself, where an organization founded in the 19th century killed 2 judges in 2 separate bomb attacks within 2 months of each other in 1992, and then survived every attempt to destroy it across more than a century of unbroken criminal history. Case 10. Italy, Sicily. Cosa Nostra. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, a triangular landmass sitting at the southernmost tip of Italy, closer to the North African coast than to Rome. It has been conquered and ruled by Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, and French over the course of its history. A relentless rotation of foreign powers that left the island with deep poverty, a nearly absent central government, and a population that had learned across many centuries that the only reliable protection came from the people immediately around you, not from any state. That experience is the foundation on which Cosa Nostra was built. The word Mafia itself comes from Sicily. In 19th century Sicilian dialect, The word mafioso described a man who was bold, proud, and fearless, someone who would not submit to authority. It was a character trait, not a criminal label. The public association of the word with organized crime was first widely made in 1863, when a Sicilian play called I mafiosi di la Vicaria, set in a Palermo prison, depicted a criminal brotherhood with its own hierarchy, code of conduct, and initiation rituals.
When Sicily was absorbed into the new Italian state in 1860, the sudden change in land ownership, large feudal estates broken up and sold off, the church's vast landholdings redistributed, created chaos in the countryside. The new state had almost no real administrative or police presence on the island. Into that vacuum stepped the gabelotti, the men who managed large estates on behalf of absentee noble landowners. They hired armed guards who began extorting fees from the people they were supposed to protect. Those guards organized. They enforced agreements, settled disputes, provided security in a place where the state provided none. Then they turned against the landowners themselves, forcing the former nobility to pay for protection from the same men they had hired. By the 1880s, the Italian government was effectively using these criminal networks as informal agents of local governance in Sicily, not fighting the mafia, but leaning on it to run the island. The organization's real name, as confirmed by mafia turncoats beginning in the 1980s, is Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing in Italian. Its members are known among themselves as men of honor. Its core principle is omerta, an absolute code of silence in which a member never cooperates with authorities under any circumstances. Breaking omerta is punishable by death. The structure is built around individual clans called cosce, each controlling a specific territory in and around Palermo and across western Sicily. Each clan has a boss, a deputy boss, and a number of lieutenants overseeing smaller cells. Above the individual clans sits a governing body called the Commission, which coordinates decisions affecting the organization as a whole, including the decision to kill public officials, which requires approval from the top. Cosa Nostra followed Sicilian immigrants to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the American version, built in the Italian neighborhoods of New York, New Orleans, and Chicago, grew into a parallel organization that eventually became one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history. The Sicilian and American branches maintained contact, cooperating on the international heroin trade and holding meetings to divide territory and manage disputes. The most significant of these meetings happened in 1957 in a hotel in Palermo, attended by senior bosses from both sides of the Atlantic, including Joseph Bonanno, Carmine Galante, and Lucky Luciano on the American side, and Gaetano Badalamenti, Tommaso Buscetta, and others on the Sicilian side. The agenda included organizing the so-called Pizza Connection, a narcotics network that used Sicilian-American pizza restaurants across the United States as fronts for distributing heroin refined in Sicily from Golden Crescent opium. Inside Sicily, Cosa Nostra extended its influence into every corner of the island's economy. Between 1959 and 1963, approximately 80% of all building permits in Palermo were issued to just 5 individuals, none of whom represented significant construction firms, all believed to be mafia frontmen. The entire post-war reconstruction boom on the island, financed by Italian state money, was effectively stolen and channeled through mafia-controlled contractors. Politicians who wanted to win elections in Sicily needed votes. To get votes, they needed the clans. The clans delivered, and then collected on that debt through construction contracts, government supply deals, and legal protection. The Corleonesi were a mafia family from the small town of Corleone, about 60 kilometers south of Palermo. In the 1950s, the Palermo bosses who ran the commission dismissed them as provincial outsiders, peasants, in the contemptuous slang of the city clans. What the Palermo bosses missed was that Salvatore Rina, who took command of the Corleonesi after their original leader, Luciano Leggio, was imprisoned in 1974, was not interested in the existing rules of the organization. Where other bosses sought to minimize attention and work within agreed boundaries, Rina was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. Bosses, judges, politicians, police officers, carabinieri, journalists, and the family members of turncoats. In the early 1980s, the Corleonesi launched what became known as the Second Mafia War. Over 3 years, they systematically murdered rival clan bosses and their allies across Palermo. By 1983, Rina effectively controlled Cosa Nostra. He is estimated to have been personally responsible for, or to have ordered, more than 1,000 murders during his criminal career. The state was not standing still. In 1982, after the Mafia assassinated Carabinieri General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, who had been sent to Sicily specifically to crush the organization, the Italian parliament finally passed the Rognoni La Torre law, which made Mafia membership itself a criminal offense for the first time, and allowed investigators to confiscate assets. 2 young magistrates in Palermo's anti-mafia pool, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, began building a case using a methodology that no one had applied before. Instead of investigating individual crimes in isolation, Falcone followed the money, tracing financial flows across banks, businesses, and shell companies to map the entire structure of the organization. He cultivated the first major mafia turncoat, a senior Cosa Nostra boss named Tommaso Buscetta, who in 1984 began providing testimony that for the first time confirmed the internal hierarchy of Cosa Nostra from a member's own mouth, and provided a map of the entire organization's structure and leadership. On February 10, 1986, in a specially constructed bunker courtroom built in 6 months at a cost of 36 billion lire and capable of withstanding rocket or missile attacks, the Maxi trial opened. There were 475 defendants charged across 120 crimes, including murder, drug trafficking, extortion, and mafia association. The trial lasted 21 months, through 349 hearings. On December 16, 1987, the verdict arrived. 360 guilty verdicts, including 19 life sentences and a combined total of 2,665 years of imprisonment. The Supreme Court confirmed the convictions on January 30, 1992. It was the first time in Italian legal history that Cosa Nostra had been judicially established as a unified, hierarchical organization. Rina, who had been given 2 life sentences in absentia, had been counting on the appeals process to eventually void the convictions, as it had done many times before for convicted mafiosi. When the Supreme Court upheld them instead, the commission met and made a decision. The state would be attacked directly. The targets would be the men who had done the most damage. On May 23, 1992, Giovanni Falcone boarded a plane in Rome to fly home to Palermo for the weekend. His wife, Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate, was with him. 3 police officers formed his escort. He landed at Palermo's Punta Raisi airport and got into his white Fiat Croma for the short drive into the city on Highway A29. Cosa Nostra had been preparing for months. Under the motorway near the town of Capaci, members of the Corleonesi had excavated a culvert and packed it with approximately 400 kilograms of explosives, TNT, and ammonium nitrate, moved into position on a skateboard, detonated by a remote control operated by Giovanni Brusca from a hillside above the highway. Brusca pressed the button at 5:56 p.m. as Falcone's convoy passed. The explosion was so powerful, it registered on monitoring equipment tracking volcanic tremors from Mount Etna on the other side of the island. The first car in the convoy was blown into an orchard of olive trees, killing agents Antonio Montanaro, Vito Schifani, and Rocco Di Cillo instantly. Falcone and his wife were thrown through the windscreen of their car by the blast. All 5 died. Rina is reported to have toasted the assassination with champagne. 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino drove to his mother's apartment building on Via D'Amelio in Palermo. A Fiat 126 packed with explosives detonated as he approached the entrance. Borsellino was killed along with 5 members of his police escort: Agostino Catalano, Walter Cosina, Emanuela Loi, Vincenzo Limuli, and Claudio Trena. Emanuela Loi became the first Italian female police officer killed in the line of duty. The funerals of the 2 judges were broadcast live on national television. All regular programming was suspended. Italy was in shock. Police officer Rosaria Costa, widow of Vito Schifani, who had been killed with Falcone, stood at the funeral and spoke directly to Cosa Nostra in front of the cameras, saying she forgave them, but asking them to kneel and repent. Her words moved the entire country and turned public opinion in Sicily decisively against the organization for the first time in its history. On January 15, 1993, Carabinieri arrested Salvatore Rina at a villa in Palermo. He had been in hiding for 23 years. The man who had ordered 1,000 murders, who had bombed a highway and a city street to kill judges, was found in a suburban house, living quietly with a false identity. He was convicted and died in prison in 2017. In 1993 and into 1994, Cosa Nostra bombed the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, 2 churches in Rome, and an art gallery in Milan. 10 people were killed across those attacks. The bombings were intended to pressure the Italian government into easing the strict isolation prison regime, Article 41 bis, that had been imposed on convicted mafia bosses after the 1992 killings. The bombings had the opposite effect. The government tightened the regime further. Dozens of mafia members began cooperating with investigators. The organization fractured at the leadership level, with successive bosses arrested and replaced. Rina's successor as the dominant boss in hiding was Bernardo Provenzano, who ran Cosa Nostra's operations from inside Sicily for 37 years, the longest time any major mafia boss had ever evaded capture. He was arrested in April 2006 in a farmhouse near Corleone, the town where Cosa Nostra's modern form had been forged. He died in a prison hospital in 2016. After Provenzano's arrest, the last remaining figure considered by investigators to be the boss of bosses was Matteo Messina Denaro, known as Diabolic, a nickname taken from an Italian comic book villain. He had been a fugitive since 1993, convicted in absentia of involvement in the killings of Falcone and Borsellino, the 1993 bombings, and the murder of 12-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo, the son of a turncoat whom Cosa Nostra kidnapped to pressure the father into retracting his testimony. The boy was held for 2 years and then strangled. His body was dissolved in acid. Messina Denaro had accumulated 20 life sentences through trials conducted without him. Investigators tracked Messina Denaro for decades. The breakthrough came not through surveillance or informants, but through Italy's national health system database. Investigators had established that the fugitive was receiving chemotherapy treatment under a false name. They traced the patient records. On January 16, 2023, exactly 30 years and 1 day after Rina's arrest in 1993, Carabinieri entered a private clinic in Palermo and arrested Matteo Messina Denaro, 61 years old, sitting in a treatment chair receiving his chemotherapy. When bystanders outside the clinic realized who had been arrested, they applauded. Palermo's chief prosecutor declared that they had captured the last of the massacre masterminds. Messina Denaro died in a prison hospital on September 25, 2023, from colon cancer, 8 months after his arrest, after 30 years as a fugitive. Cosa Nostra has an estimated 5,000 affiliates and approximately 20,000 associates still active in Sicily. The organization no longer commands the island with the direct terror it used in the 1980s and 1990s.
But it has not disappeared. It has adapted, moving deeper into construction, energy contracts, and waste disposal, using legitimate business fronts that make its money harder to trace. A 2023 Italian government report found that all 4 Italian mafias combined generate revenues equivalent to approximately 2% of Italy's GDP. Cosa Nostra remains the oldest criminal organization on this list, the one that gave the world the word mafia, and the one that has outlasted every dictator, every anti-mafia law, every judge who tried to end it.
Giovanni Falcone, who understood Cosa Nostra better than almost anyone, once said that it is a human phenomenon, and like all human phenomena, it has a beginning and it will have an end. He was killed before he could see that end. Sicily is still waiting for it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.